have you had a chance to read anything about Generations for Peace, the one-pager, or not yet? Do you need a bit of background? Everyone's read it? Wow, okay, that's brilliant. Thank you for doing that. So that first diagram at the top, Steve emphasized this. I think global action networks in a kind of network-centric world are really connecting these different sectors. So the government sector, business sector, civil society, NGO sectors. And so the first explicit thing is Generations for Peace is a non-profit, non-governmental organization. So we're one of those types of organizations. And I guess we do connect with governments because we get funding from different donor governments, Jordanian government, US government, Norwegian government, Belgian government, and from UN agencies as well. And we connect very strongly with civil society because that's really where our programs are happening, through volunteer-led actions at the grassroots in communities. And often we are partnering with very small civil society organizations in different countries. So I can see some obvious links there. With the business side of it, we have some small partnerships with business entities, Samsung, DHL, and Orange, that are really, they're not sponsorship, they're sort of small CSR, I would say, corporate sustainability relationships. So providing a little bit of value in both directions.
Is it mainly financial value they provide?
Actually, it's a mix of cash and value in kind support. So, yeah, but relatively small compared to the governmental or UN support that we get. So I think in the sectoral space, that second table, I think as an organisation, we're probably, as an NGO, we're probably more on the civil society side. But I've put down this question: if a non-profit organisation, a non-governmental organisation, gets most of its funding from the governmental sector, and I'm including United Nations agencies on that side, then is it really non-governmental, or is it more on the governmental side? It's a kind of question. Are we really just an implementing agency for government policies? Are we a service provider, in fact? So there's some questions there also about true independence and being truly non-governmental, depending where the money is coming from and whose policies you are servicing.
Are they influencing in decision making or just funding?
I think all NGOs are influenced to the extent that they chase the money. Yeah. So, I mean, there are real limits on that. We have to be really careful that we're only going for things that are truly supporting our own core mission, and we have absolute freedom to say no to things. So in that sense, we're independent.
So I think the core question is whether you have a contractual relationship or a collaborative relationship with these other entities. So a collaborative relationship would be distinguished by collective direction setting and priority identification, where a contractual relationship would be, we have a contract to do this work, and we've managed to get that contract.
Okay, so sorry, one thing, we're supposed to have a scribe. It would be great if it wasn't me, so that I can also kind of focus on what I'm trying to get through. Is anyone wanting to volunteer to try and take notes? So you can use the handout to scribble things. Yeah?
I don't mind.
Rachel, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. And when it comes to the feedback, we can all chip in. But if Rachel's able to take some headlines, that'll be great.
Can I just ask, sort of go back a bit and ask a question? Does it really matter if you're a global action network or not? I mean, if you're effective, it doesn't matter what category you fit into. I think for me a more interesting question is, what makes you so effective? What are the conditions of sustainability? And what are the conditions of your reach and the fact that you actually generate stuff on the ground?
Okay, that's a great question. We may get back to it more at the end, but I think my instinct is that the fact we're talking about this at all is because we feel global action networks do have some unique scale, capacity, ability, opportunities that to achieve more impact and the sorts of impact that Generations Peace is interested in, so reducing conflict and violence,
So is
than
it-
we
is
could
there-
achieve alone.
Is there a sense that you're not achieving what you would like to achieve, and that you're working with some kinds of constraint or something because of the way
Yeah,
you say?
I think there's an understanding that we're young, we're only 8 years old, and we're growing and evolving, and so there's a question about whether either becoming a global action network or joining a global action network might be something to work towards in the future, if we feel that that's where there's some added value and greater possibility for more impact.
In terms of the conditions of what makes them effective. Because I'm struggling with this. Why do you have to
Well,
put
one
a
is-
label on it? I mean,
Yeah. Well,
one.
one is scale. So how many people in how many communities could we reach? And a lot of the constraints on scale are around resources, both financial and kind of human capacity, access to communities. So there's some sense of needing to partner, needing to extend ourselves that way.
I
If
think
I
that's
were to provide an answer, I would say that you are element 3, a local. The answer to Rachel and to be in peace in a way for that. You're a local organization because you need to act locally as you're doing.
Yeah, all our work is very local in communities, grassroots stuff. We're very small. We have a small headquarters in Jordan with just 33 staff and about a dozen interns each year. But we have just under 9,000 volunteers in 50 countries. So that's really the kind of a network of its own, a community of its own. But I want to come back to Steve's question about collaborative or contractual relationships.
I just want to finish off with Rachel's, which I think is important because there's two ways of approaching what you're asking, I think. One is saying what we're doing now is valuable and we want to sustain what we're doing now. And so that means that we want to make sure that we don't destroy what we're doing now.
Yes.
And the other thing is, if we scan the field of peacemaking, I don't know if that's the way I describe it.
Peace building, yeah.
Is there something in this field that is missing that would really help us to be much more impactful? And so rather than, as you're currently thinking about it, I mean, I think it's open. It's one question, one strategy. After you've answered that question, then you can figure out whether we want to transform Generations for Peace into that thing that's missing, or whether we want to create something new with some other actors that can help, can create more of the enabling environment that will help Generations for Peace do its work much better.
Yeah. Or join one if we identify there is in fact something already existing that we're just not part of.
I was interested in you meeting Peter.
Yeah. Okay, so I think all of those are valid questions, and for us it's kind of thinking about future evolution. In the network types diagram, you're saying the global action networks are kind of, they're simultaneously organizations and inter-organizational partnerships and inter-organizational networks. So I think, yeah, we that resonates with us, that we're an organization, small headquarters, supporting volunteers. We have many inter-organizational partnerships, so with donors and with local implementing partners, civil society organizations on the ground. And we have are we an inter-organizational network? Probably not so much at the moment, but that's an area of interest. If we feel there's added value without too much added cost.
So just to clarify then, that today, it doesn't all come down to the formal structure. I just want to say that. There's lots of ways the formal structure can just be latent or passive and support what's happening. But today your direction or your sense of accountability is towards a board.
Yeah, in a way, our accountability is to our beneficiaries and communities. number one.
And is that
Yeah, if we
reflected
don't-
in your structure?
Not enough, because we.
Any
That's a
overview
great
of-
question, actually, because we don't have grassroots community representation on our board. Our board at the moment is very, very small. But that would be a good direction to go, and a number of NGOs, as they've evolved, start to do that more. I think that's a really healthy direction for us to think about growing into. So, because I do feel that our number one accountability is to beneficiaries and communities. If we're not accountable to them and the impact we're having in their environment, then we're not set up the right way. So at the moment, just being 8 years old, it's the board that, yeah, in a way we're accountable to in structural terms.
But they aren't very active or directed. You don't feel a lot of direction from them.
Yeah, not very active, nor very directive. Now that gives us a lot of freedom, which is good, but it doesn't give us much support.
So what's the key decision-making body then, do you think?
Our senior management team at the moment, yeah.
But is there, because I'm trying to relate it to my environment, the charity sector, where you know we have an accountability to people experiencing cancer in the UK.
Yeah.
But actually, back to your point, we don't ask them greatly about those investments directly.
Yeah.
But we have a formal accountability to the board of trustees. But back to your point, they are not particularly active. The active management is through the senior executive team.
Yeah.
But actually, officially, it should be played out by the board of trustees who come from various sectors. So there's a sort of, there is a quasi-contractual relationship,
Yeah.
but it's actually exercised by an executive body.
Now, experienced non-profit board members will try to play that role of representing beneficiaries in the types of questions that they're asking in supervising. But it's even better if the board members themselves are actually from those beneficiary communities. And we don't have that yet, but that's something we could look at. I think we're also, so if we're accountable to beneficiaries first, but not structurally at the moment, our second accountability is to our volunteers, and that's really strong. So in terms of remaining engaged with them, listening to them, getting feedback from them, and supporting them, that's really strong. And then our third accountability of necessity is to our donors. So a lot of donor reporting, both in financial reporting terms and audit, but also in providing evidence of the impact that we're achieving with their support.
Do you ever
How do
con-
they influence you?
That's back to Steve's collaborative or contractual. I would, to be honest, most of those relationships are probably too heavily contractual. It's just the nature that they're government entities. They have kind of grant structures that are very bureaucratic, very contractual in their nature. There's not much space for true collaboration or even innovation. And so they'll put out calls for proposals. If they resonate with what we actually do, then we apply, we go through a competitive process. Then we may get the award, but then it's very contractual after that. And the reporting cycles are very contractual as well.
The evaluation criteria.
Yeah, now, there's quite a diversity of different donors, so some are much more flexible than others and much better. Scandinavian ones tend to be refreshingly open to ideas compared with others.
I was wondering about the facets of this, because your first question was a sort of or question, and I wondered whether it can be an and question, both.
Yeah.
Because if I look at my present environment, it's quite contractual with donors, big corporates, funding for particular things, for improvements in say services. We have some contractual arrangements with the health sector, okay, funding of nurses, but then a very collaborative approach with over 10,000 volunteers who work with us not on any contractual basis, but simply from a wish to improve the lives of people affected by cancer. So there's quite a number of, I don't know whether, are you a network if you just, everything is networked, or are you a network if, you know, you have some contractual arrangements because the funding brings that in, but actually you work primarily in quite a collaborative approach with a huge community of people whose only relationship with you is the common, you know, ambition to improve the lives of people, or whatever the ambition of your organisation is. So I'm trying to, you know, where it's not It's not
So-
one or more, it's both.
Both and.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of both and thinking. But I want to emphasise your point about volunteers, because I think that's very relevant to many non-profits. And it may not be formalised, but in a way there's a kind of social contract between a non-profit and volunteers, and that is incredibly important. Really, Generations for Peace is a volunteer movement. And if we're not able to attract and support and retain volunteers, then we won't achieve anything, and we certainly won't be sustainable. So we put a lot of effort into how we do that, how we train them, or how we select them in the first place is really important. Then train them, mentor them, support them, and give them a development pathway so they stay with us for years and years and years. And also giving them the skills to train other volunteers so that a cohort of volunteers in any community can continue to grow organically, even though as they go through life changes and get married and move cities or get a new job, they'll continue to drop off. So, yeah.
No, so it makes me think that maybe it's just a question of prioritising where you put your energy. It sounds as if you say that the volunteer network is key, and maybe that your research should be around that, how to make that more effective.
Yeah, I think in terms of energy, we do prioritise that top in our strategic planning. That's always top, is what are we doing with our volunteers and how can we continue that development? Yeah.
And can you take any of the principles from network theory from the action network?
I don't know.
I'm wondering about the learning side in particular,
Okay.
action learning. I mean, how do you actually do the learning loops with
Because the thing that comes to my mind, if I could make the leap, that is totally insufficient data to suggest, but what I suspect is there's something about the enabling environment that you sense is inhibiting the strategy that you've identified as being really powerful from becoming much more impactful or widely spread. Now, if that were true, then what sort of interventions might you take to be able to shift the enabling environment, which is what I'll talk about tomorrow, actually.
Okay.
But one of the key ones is to, in this field, it's a lot about community organizing. And what I mean by community, I mean communities of interest or commonality. So one big intervention would be to invite together your funders to a meeting and to create a space where they would be able to learn about what's working and what's not. And one of your sort of goals would be to have the Swedes or the Nordic funders, explain why they're doing what they're doing and how they're doing it, to be able to share what they've learned with others, and to work out a strategy to create more funding opportunities that would reflect the type that's needed for the complex change work that you're doing. And then what Rachel was saying about organizing the, so then thinking of them as being a learning community.
Yeah.
So, and then organizing the volunteers as a learning community, so that you would then prioritize both the organizing and the capacity development of these different stakeholder groups to be able to shift the operating environment to get many more people doing either explicitly or implicitly what you think needs to be done.
So this is great. I think on the volunteer side, we're already trying to do that. So one of the most valuable things we do is bringing the most experienced volunteers from around the world together for advanced training, but it's really horizontal learning. So it's not so much vertical learning of us giving them advanced sort of knowledge and skills, it's much more them sharing. But we've never done it with donors and partners. We're always just doing those conversations individually. So it's a great idea actually to make that a systematic
And the
process
UN
every
Global
year.
Compact has a particular program around peace with its companies,
Okay.
the role of companies in peace building, and I'm sure they'd be delighted to have such a case group to work with, and to take the same sort of approach of corporations understanding how they can contribute to peace building. Because a lot of them are working in these highly volatile environments, and it's a key question for them.
Okay. I feel we should move on a little bit.
You were going in the direction of your question that you asked earlier about what is appropriate financing for this kind of work, which would be less constraining financing in a way, having people understand better what you're doing so that they don't place the constraints that tenders place on you and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Stupid reporting systems.
I mean,
Is that-
yeah, so that kind of donor engagement and donor education so that they
But
can
create
take-
it so it's a peer group.
Yeah.
Otherwise, in the
Yes.
bilaterals, you end up trapped into your relationship discussion.
Yeah.
So you're creating a network of funders in a way
Exactly.
that talk to each other.
And I think there are I know in the United States there is something called the Peace Network for Funders on Peace or something
Okay.
like that.
Yeah. All right.
Have we implemented any process similar to customer voice?
Customer.
Customer voice. So, because you told us that there's nothing from the field, nothing from the communities in the board.
Correct. Yeah.
So many companies are using systems or processes to listen more to their clients. In your case, your clients are your communities. No?
Yeah. So we're doing it with our volunteers who are living in those communities, but we're not. And we have for every program we have participatory processes for evaluating programs every year, which include people from the communities. But we don't have that as a structural thing within the organisation.
So there's no one from each community that has the opportunity to tell something
They
or
do
share something with the board,
not with the board.
because that has an incredible emotional impact.
Yeah.
See the case of these Indian women going to the United Nations.
So there's a distinction the Filipinos use that I find very useful between NGOs, which are sort of they're considered sort of the professionalized part of civil society, and people's organizations, which are like neighborhood associations.
Okay.
And for the Philippines, that's been a very useful distinction, and that they aren't the same, although they're often linked into being the same, and to organize them separately can often be very powerful. To support their thinking of them separately can be often very powerful.
All right. Can we have a quick look at the 7 characteristics?
Could I just ask you to elaborate on that?
It's difficult to manage this meeting.
Shown his bureaucratic
We have
tendency.
more questions than answers.
Performance targets here.
No,
I
but
need
I
to
didn't
leave
quite
them.
get what you meant by that. Why should you separate them if they can be useful
Because
in working together?
the people's organizations are what in the aid world would be called the recipient organization, the beneficiaries.
beneficiaries, yeah.
The beneficiaries. And we've got to get out of this sort of, you want to move out of the top-down thing so that you can have the beneficiary support their articulation and power in the system. So that often has to do with aggregating their voice and supporting them to be articulate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't that I mean, what would you call the microcredit thing? Because isn't that kind of people run with some? I mean, I don't know enough about it, but
Well, there
How
are
would you-
beneficiaries, that do form, yes, microcredit circles,
Yeah.
lending circles, yes.
I had a question about that. I'm not so sure which it responds to any specific item you have here. Is the organization primarily based in Jordan? Is that where most of the activity takes place?
No, the full-time staff are in Jordan,
Yeah,
but
okay.
the volunteers are in 50 countries.
Okay, is Jordan your biggest individual project?
No, it probably is just by nature of the Syrian refugee crisis right now, and
Okay.
it's because so much donor attention is there, and because we are there as our headquarters, it's easier for us to get money there than anywhere else.
Yeah. And the second question I had is related to the issue that Rachel has brought up. When we were here 3 years ago, we talked about the Grameen model.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went back home, I started to read a little bit more about the Grameen model and became a little bit
Yeah.
contaminated to the extent that Mr. whatever his name is got into trouble in his own country with the authorities. And of course, related to that is if your budget were to triple, you know, either through sponsorship through the government or Mr. Gates or whoever, what will happen to your model?
That's a really good question. So I think we're really conscious that we want to have more impact in more places. So we do want to scale up. That's part of our strategy. The speed at which we do that, we are trying also to build an organization as we go and trying to maintain and develop an organizational culture as we go. So that is putting the brakes on how fast we grow. So too is our ability to access more funding. So it's not just the money. If the money suddenly was no problem, we'd still be quite cautious about, you know, do we suddenly double or triple our headquarters team? That's going to have a massive impact on our culture. So at the moment we don't have the luxury of having money being no problem. So we're able to kind of grow incrementally, reasonably fast incrementally.
You would find, I think, very useful something called value network analysis, which will help you understand roles that are necessary for success, because it sounds to me that you're having trouble distinguishing between Generations for Peace as an organization from the activities that need to be undertaken, which to be able to reach the Generations for Peace's sort of aspired future.
Yeah.
And there are numerous strategies to do that. And I think there's a natural tendency for us to think about, you know, making Generations for Peace more bigger, right? And that might not be the, you know, just to your point, I don't think that might not be the good one.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, so we want to have more impact in more places. That doesn't necessarily mean our organization needs to be bigger, but it does mean we need a way of supporting and sustaining more volunteers. Now, whether that's through more partnerships
Right.
or
So
through
that's the question.
growing our own
Okay.
organization.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to point you to the enabling environment and
Okay.
understanding what this change system is that's emerging.
So I'm going to have a longer conversation with you about value network analysis. I'm conscious of the time. The characteristics, I think, if I
You want
whiz...
to get us back to the model.
well, I want to get us back to the interesting questions at the end.
He's smiling, but
We just behave him as a network now.
Are we
trying hard, eh? You're trying hard.
Personal authority on the network.
are we global and multi-level? Kind of yes. Are we diversity embracing? Yes, I think very explicitly.
No, but you're not global and multi-level, right?
Okay.
You're not working in the United States and applying your,
No, but well,
methodology
it depends what you
there,
mean by global.
well, that's what I
50
mean.
countries is reasonably global. Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe.
You're speaking like a North American.
It depends what you mean by global. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right,
I
but
agree with you.
But there's a Pareto there, though. You do most of your stuff in maybe 2 or 3. I'm asking
Yeah.
2 or 3 places, or is it?
No,
widely
I mean
distributed?
right now we've got programs active in 39 countries
Okay.
out of the 50, so, and they go through rotating cycles.
In which area?
Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, parts of Asia, so Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal,
All the different
Central
bits.
Asia, Balkans.
see, I was not
Caucasus.
calling for you to be global. I was just calling you to be explicit about that you're global in many ways. You see, because part of the tension we're facing today is this divide between North and South.
Okay.
And the mental model that we have of the South needs financial resources, so when we say we're global, it's usually built upon some aid industry model about
Yeah.
trying to get money out of the North to do something in the South. And part of the challenge is to get beyond that because we're working into a globalized world. So just to be a very short example, one of them is around the AIDS crisis and the application of an airport tax, a flight tax, airline tax, to those international flights. Now, Namibia is a big recipient of AIDS money, but they've applied the tax to their international flights, so they're also a contributor to the fund.
Okay.
So somehow we've got to get out of this north-south thing.
And I think we are still caught in that as the main sort of funding paradigm.
And I'm not saying that this should be a priority for you to take on. I'm just flagging it as to be clear about what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But is that also part of the whole noblesse oblige? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
This whole noblesse oblige, culture that we grew up with.
A bit. I mean, I guess when we look at the resourcing, the major governmental donors are definitely from the global north and in particular west. But a lot of our resources for programs are coming locally from the communities themselves and local stakeholders there. And that's really important for sustainability. So it's kind of about 40% of resources are coming from there. Diversity embracing, I think so, both in our headquarters and in our volunteer community, and actually explicitly in our work. It's all about embracing different perspectives. Systemic change agents. I think we work at all three levels. Reflected again when you talked about triple loop learning today. We try and do that explicitly in our organisation and with our volunteers. So in our programming processes, there are questions in each program cycle that are at the level of triple loop questions, not just single and double loop questions. Are we an inter-organisational network? I think only to the extent we've got those kind of vertical relationships between donors and us and local partners with whom our volunteers may be connected. I don't think we're very good at kind of horizontal relationships.
But it's
with
also
other organisations.
inter-organizational networks. I meant there's a collaboration there rather than a contractual dynamic.
Probably a bit more contractual than collaborative. Yeah.
Do the various, because it's not a field I know at all particularly, the various peace organisations work well together? Do you collaborate with them? I'm just conscious that the third sector in the UK is not known for its collaboration with one another. We like to collaborate with people downstream, but collaboration across the sort of environment is less well done.
We're just beginning to do that more, I think. So you're right, we've been doing it vertically. Horizontally, we're starting to do joint donor proposals. So we're collaborating with other NGOs and together we're applying for funding. So we've got a number of those on the go right now. We haven't finished one successfully yet, so they're all in the pipeline.
Coordination of interventions, because I don't know if you know, what's her name, Gay. She was a former CCC participant, and I remember a slide that she produced of one African village with about 60 different NGOs intervening on one single village. And it's like hyper
gets
overload
ridiculous.
of these poor African villages, with all these things coming at them. I mean, how does that work as regards your organisation? How much do you coordinate?
We
collaborate
coordinate
in the sense of not overloading communities with stuff.
So we coordinate a lot in order to identify where the gaps are. So we look at different levels of conflict analysis and needs analysis, and then also work out, because there may be high priorities, but a number of actors are already dealing in that space. So we leave that alone and we look for where the gaps are.
Like food or something, feeding people, and then you would do something else.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're
deal with
explicitly
feeding people,
interested in the sort of conflict and violence side of things. So we've got our, it's not a niche, but our narrow sort of mission that's maybe different to all those other needs. But even in that narrow mission, there may be other people doing very similar things. So if we feel they're already satisfying that need, we'll look for other gaps.
So you opt out rather than trying to
collaborate with.
how to work together with them
I think at the moment, yes.
on the field level.
And I think that comes just from an experience that whenever you partner, it's just sucking time and energy.
Yeah, because you have to sit in rooms all the time to work.
Yeah,
things
and
out.
we say no to a lot of that.
It's what you were saying. I
Yeah.
thought that was really interesting. What you were saying about people working out the rules of the governance, basically, for
Yeah.
so long before they actually get into action, whereas you're getting into action or avoiding having to spend too much
Yeah.
time on the governance stuff.
And we push back a lot on that, even with our donors. We just say, no, we can't turn up to that meeting, we can't go to that conference, we can't do this or that, because we're focused
Because
on...
it takes you away from the action.
Yeah.
And you're sticking to your knitting, you're sticking to your mission. At what stage would you say, well, you know, it looks like there are opportunities for us to expand this mission, to review this mission? I think that's one of the questions. And the same thing about, you know, what does the market offer in terms of
Yeah.
opportunity? And I'm talking like if I'm a capitalist here, no, but that's I didn't plan to use those words, but
I think there's a, you know, when we look at other NGOs that have 300 staff or more, compared with us that have sort of 33, then clearly if you've got 300 staff, you can send people all over the place to be there, to engage, and to be visible. For us, we have to just be really selective about.
Well, it's being clear that you're not about creating the enabling environment, right? You're about doing the work in very specific spaces. And I find that a lot of NGOs I always remember being in a New York meeting, and they were so delighted that they got the periods and the commas changed in the document, and the document itself was never going to see the light of day.
Yeah.
But you know, you don't want to get into that.
No, we don't. No, we explicitly do not want to go down that road. Yeah.
that I was quite interested because I have found that fundamentally in networks of the coordination effort can be absolutely huge. So I was really interested in how can you get that to sensible proportions? Is it so loosely defined that you allow people, you know, quite a lot of latitude, but in areas where you're trying to all agree to a sort of common goal, sometimes the coordination, you just think...
I
that's
feel
the
human
that the
element of-
cost-benefit
just
doesn't
let's
seem
not
to
do
work
this.
out.
Yeah.
But that's where I find it very useful to distinguish between coordination, which is a task-oriented word, and coherence, which is a system-oriented word.
Yeah.
So coherence does not mean that you agree upon a goal, or that you're going to do something closely together, or that somebody else has to do something you want them to do. It means that you're moving in the general direction, you're aware of them, and your peripheral vision, and that you can take advantage to develop synergies and address gaps. And I think this coordination thing is badly understood because people think it's going to happen between a ridiculous number of organizations, which it just can't.
Or individual.
It's about creating sensing mechanisms for when we can work together when it makes sense,
Like a
on an ad
patchwork.
hoc basis. Yeah.
Rather than trying to work, spending so much time synchronizing, you kind of just fill the field, as it were, in
Exactly.
a patchwork way.
So we're trying to avoid those energy traps at the moment. I want to jump to the competencies question. So Steve's got this slide of Global Action Network competencies, and I've just put we haven't really sort of explored that in detail. I've just put another diagram and then a list of sort of capacities. This is the model that we've been using, in fact, for the last 5 years in a row now, for organizational capacity assessment and therefore development each year. It's just one model. But I'm interested in what you think might be the particular competencies that are needed for effective networks compared with effective organizations. Because some of in the leadership, well, you need leadership. Is it a different type of leadership for networks?
Should be natural and volunteer. And based more in emotional and commitment with the vision or the purpose. If not, you're going to have a typical management style, directive style. So I think one of the issues in those kind of networks is to find the right natural leaders, network leaders, and find them.
And is the leadership function shared, or does a network need a leader? That's a
Well,
question.
that's a debate I've had with a lot of networks because I said, you are called an executive director of a network, and there's something that is hugely paradoxical
Yes.
in that, right? I encourage the term steward rather than leader, actually.
Uh-huh.
And the book, Global Action Network, goes into a lot about the differences between traditional leadership and what I
Stewardship.
More like servant leadership, that
Yeah,
kind of
servant.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And there's a wonderful book a colleague put out called Leaderfulness. And because part of the stewardship work is about creating leaderfulness in the organization so that people see themselves as co-leaders rather than,
distributed.
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But I've stopped using the word leadership except when you need to translate it for people.
Okay.
What's interesting,
But-
in the McKinsey model, it doesn't have the word relationships. Where are the relationships here?
Yeah. Well,
It's
yeah,
basically another version of the 7S.
it is another version of the 7S. Yeah, that's exactly where McKinsey developed it from. Relationships
Surprise, surprise.
within an organisation.
And so
Yeah. I think some of it would appear under the organisational culture side of it, maybe relationships, but I think
something
there's
in 310 is there around partnerships. I suspect that's a very
there's relationships in
Right.
different directions, internal and external. Yeah.
Partnerships doesn't necessarily have the sort of emotional connection to it.
No.
You know
Could
what
be a
I'm
very
not saying here,
contractual
but maybe
partnership.
it's embedded in culture. This whole thing about values and integrity and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Is it embedded in culture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you got I guess it might be partly under aspirations,
Okay.
it's kind of values as well, but then the embodiment of values in action
Mhm.
would be in culture,
Okay.
including performance as a shared value.
Is there something, the McKinsey model seems to have a definition of organisation that is completely seems to be alien to your thinking around a network. So it's almost as though they operate in very different paradigms. But if you have this
Yeah.
concept of the organisation and organising,
I know I hate the
Structure.
model. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because this is we see
like
that
it
I
for-
see this
for-
all the time. People take organization stuff and apply it to networks.
I'm not sorry. I'm not proposing that we should apply this to networks. I'm not. All I was
This is
just.
great for IBM, but if
I was
for
just
IBM,
reflecting.
I would do it this way. You know?
No, I was
That's
just
your-
reflecting. This
no.
is when we look at competencies.
Cancel at the other side. This is a better network.
I think there are different competencies that are needed, though. So
No, of
that's
course,
where I'm
yeah.
getting. So,
Yeah, it's not this.
however strong you might be as an organisation, and whether that McKinsey model is helpful in identifying your strengths or not, there's something different that you need.
This is
Yeah.
probably some hygienic basics because you have an organisation, but maybe some of it is not useful at all.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, if you're stuck in this paradigm, it could be a constraint.
Yeah.
Well, it
Because
could
prevents
actually
you
Yes.
from innovating.
undermine
Yeah,
your
exactly.
ability to be
Yeah.
successful.
Steve, do you have from that summary slide of GAN competencies? Is it possible to drill down into more detail?
Oh.
You got some.
Yeah, the book does, and
Right.
the slides. I do a whole thing on competencies
Okay,
and what
so
they
that
mean.
might help
Because
us.
you can divide it into the attributes and characteristics as well, which is common for competencies. I mean, the main thing, I always find it difficult to describe those, so that's one reason I'm touchy about it. And I always say it's about a stance. You know, it's about, and I go like this, it's about a stance. And it's about how, somebody said relationship. It's about your relationship with others and the issue. And the organization is about a stance too, right? Like this, but it's not like this.
So there are some tensions, even in the coffee break we were discussing, if organizations are considering whether to either create or belong to or set up or join a network, then there are some tensions in their mind about not just what might the potential benefit be, but in particular, what might we be giving up? Does the network also contain our competitors? Even NGOs have competitors in a sense of we're all chasing donor funds. So,
Chasing organisations to
and
work on
yeah, or chasing
village-
volunteers
African
as well. Yeah.
villages to impose their stuff on.
Well, a term that's become very popular in my world is extreme collaboration. And it involves bringing together NGOs who have the same donors
Uh-huh.
and to figure out ways for them to work together, to collaborate. But these are all, right at the edge of what we know how to do well, and it's got to be
So some of the meetings we've been saying no to are precisely that, donors trying to convene, maybe they've given grants to 30 or 40 NGOs in Jordan, and they try and convene meetings. We've been to 2 of them.
Well, you've got to be very skillful about it. You've
Yeah.
got to be very purposeful about it.
Yeah.
Now, if it's convening them around developing what I would call the change system, that's a very useful thing to do. But you've got to have a very good facility. I mean, you can
Yeah.
imagine the types of dynamics and arguments you can get into if you don't have a way of actually doing the next step. It's just like throwing
the-
a lamb into the lion's den. or
Yeah,
something.
you end up organisations turn up because the donors convening the meeting, they have convening power because you want to maintain those relationships. But then you're in competition in some ways with all the other organisations around the table, and the donor doesn't really have a clear purpose. What are they trying to get from those?
But is that
meetings?
something around both the difference and the inherent conflict you've got, which is one, you need people to be able to manage your organisation effectively,
Yeah.
which has a whole set of competencies
Mhm.
around that. And we're not saying that that is lost in all of this. But then there's a different set of competencies for that organisation to network
Yeah.
effectively with other organisations. So
Yeah.
in some of those meetings, if you brought people who are comfortable in, shall we say, the McKinsey paradigm, they're going to be very uncomfortable
Yes.
in the network paradigm, and
Yeah.
they're going to want to impose organisation around it. That would be their
Right.
default.
Yes.
So
Right.
this isn't organised very well.
Yeah.
I'm now
Yeah.
going to sort this out, which is the last response you want instead
Yeah.
of that.
And when you're dealing with people who are on the boards of these global action networks, they almost, they are inter-organizational networks. So they come in with the mental model of coming from a board, and you will always hear at the meetings, they will say, well, in my organization, we do it this way. And it's always a sort of way of sharing, but it's also asserting this is the legitimate way it
Yes.
should be done.
Selling also.
And
Yeah.
I encourage,
This is
I don't see this done, but I encourage there to actually be a space at the beginning of these meetings where people are get to reorient themselves to the distinctions between a network and an organization, because it's unfair to expect them to suddenly leap from something they've been doing for the last 2 months nonstop and then be a network rather than an organization. And we've got to become much better at those ceremonies and ways of transitioning people without having unreasonable expectations, I think. And the same thing with people, there's a lot of expectation of somebody to come into these organizations and be a representative
Yes.
from their organization. And they have, they're usually early adopters. They have tremendous energy, tremendous desire to shift their organization to bring it into alignment with the network. But how they can do that is a big challenge. Like in the Forest Stewardship Council, how do you shift the forest companies to be more aligned? And they need their own community of practice around how to do that, because it's not evident, I think.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
sometimes they send a representative that also has not the internal power to change things.
Well,
Other times it's not that.
I have, I started an executive management program at Boston College around leadership and change. And what I found is everyone has some power to do it, but they might not have the imagination about what their power is. Or they might have, they might not be very skillful about using their power, or they might not be, they might have too much hubris. They might not be humble enough in trying to do it or something. But everyone has some power to do some change, in my experience. Yeah.
Your strategic plan would cover what period? 3-year period?
We're trying to do 4-year
4 years, yeah.
strategic planning. Yeah.
You
You have a
usually
plan.
Yeah.
We're actually we're coming to the end of a 4-year period and needing to
Do your
prepare the next
donors
one.
usually want to
What
see a
happened to
strategic plan?
emergence?
Well, I can show it to you. It's very flexible, deliberately.
Your donors
Especially when
usually
you
want
have a
to
million
do it?
refugees landing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your donors like to see a strategic plan?
Donors
Generally, no.
don't
Okay.
tend to ask for that. No?
Because I find when I do some work for some of these organizations, and I take whatever the strategic plan might be,
Mhm.
they want to then translate that into a business plan.
Right.
You see, and
Yeah.
that's where you lose your purity and start to converge into another space and so on. But they said, well, this doesn't look feasible, and just start using words like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, okay. Well, donors definitely want to see plan because donors
PowerPoint.
tend to
You
be
want to see the PowerPoint?
they're supporting specific programs
Yeah.
in one or a few multiple countries. They're not supporting the organization as a whole for anything. So they want to see very, very, very detailed plans
Yeah.
for what they want to fund. Yeah.
Yeah, the real difficulty here I find is that donors are generally into project funding,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's
Whereas
their
they
mentality.
aren't into understanding the network.
Yeah.
And so you've somehow got to do this thing. It's like, I always call it, it's the incorporation challenge, because there is no legal framework that is appropriate for global action networks, right? Because all the legal frameworks are nationally based. There's nothing global except for IGOs. And there's nothing that is for multi-stakeholders. Either you have to choose to be a government agency, a business, or you have to be an NGO. And
Vivian.
you don't want to be any of those either. You want to be the weaving together of those. So I always say, take whatever, model you want in terms of your legal model. Set it up so you're doing the reports to the government in the way that they will find satisfactory, the government finds satisfactory, but never take that as the basis for the way you're acting.
Yes.
You've got to do something totally different because this is not going to get you to where you want to go. And so I really resonate with what you were saying
Yeah, that's-
about how do we craft and integrate these project-based budgets in a way that gives sense to our network mission. And
Yeah.
that's such a talent, I don't know.
So it may need to be incorporated, but shouldn't behave like an incorporation.
Yeah.
Create a
Like a
model for
corporation,
it,
yeah.
kind of thing.
One of the
Set it up as a
dangers with
separate-
these organizations in my little space that I come from in Trinidad is they become, or they're at risk of becoming politicized, right? And I know of particular individuals who might have started off NGOs and networks and so on, who actually became politicians and who used the movements to kind of catapult them into the political realm. And in Trinidad, the last government, which we got rid of a few weeks ago, used a number of small sports type networks that were meant for and NGOs that were meant to protect youth at risk. Trinidad has a gang problem. And they created a fund called Sport for Life Fund. And it ended up to be a terrible slush fund. The government was actually financing criminal activity, right, and providing supposed meals for these kids by having their cronies establish businesses and supply chains and so on. And that's the risk of, in a place like Trinidad, of politicizing these well-meaning, some of them were well-meaning NGOs and so on, because the sponsor, the government, then starts to use this as
Yeah.
a vehicle for patronage.
So that's a risk as you develop a successful network,
Yeah,
then other
definitely.
people see that as an
For sure.
opportunity for
Yeah.
other
Oh, yeah,
things.
sure.
Yeah, can influence, yeah.
Can we close with the questions on the last page? Some of them we may already have answered. I think we've reflected a bit on Generations Peace current situation and whether it's a GAN or not. But I think there's some interesting things for me to follow up on to explore that. There are some things attractive about global action networks if we want to have more impact. And I think what I'm hearing a lot from Steve is that may involve us kind of rethinking how we're delivering against our values, and we may need to let go of some kind of current structural things, and that may be fine. We just need to work out how to transition.
It's what you call the enabling environment.
Yeah. Our role in creating and maintaining an enabling environment for change. Yeah. I think the last question there is one that really is on my mind, whether networks are really understanding what are networks good for. Because I can certainly see that they're really good for learning and these kind of horizontal exchanges, and everyone involved in that can benefit from that, and even the change leaders is an example of that. But I'm not, and they might be good for resource mobilization because you're connecting different people, particularly different levels of organization. But I'm not sure, just instinctively, I'm not sure if they're good at execution of things. So I don't know, that's my instinct, but I haven't explored. You had a long list of successful global action networks that appear to be executing really interesting stuff.
But that's the opposite to what you were saying, that people use networks as opposed to global organisations for their capacity to execute. So how does
But
that
where's the
work?
execution taking place?
Ah.
And so the thing that strikes me about, maybe I don't know enough about Generations for Peace,
Yeah.
is that you don't you don't have enough action centers to execution centers, because like Transparency International, I'll just use it because
Yeah.
they have a lot of execution centers,
Yeah.
right? They
Yeah.
have, like in Bangladesh, they've got a Bangladesh, TI Bangladesh, they have over 300 village level execution
Yeah.
centers.
Yeah.
And so it's not the network that is doing the execution.
Yeah.
You're quite right about that, but it is creating the environment and and providing the tools and the learning and developing the capacity so that there can be lots of execution centers.
And is it, so part of the role in that is the network is generating intellectual property and sharing it? Is
Yeah,
that
well, like the
kind of knowledge
Transparency
transfer?
Index about the way to handle these corruption-free agreements. And out of that emerges some patterns about how to address it that become part of the broader network. And they have then an ongoing development of experience and tools to advance, right? It's not about doing what we're doing, it's about advancing what we're doing. And so it requires continual development of new tools and new ways of doing it. And so that's what the network's doing.
Yeah.
It's developing those new ways of doing it, like learning journeys or,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Guys,
So-
I need to leave, sorry.
Yes,
Because I have a meeting in New
No,
York.
no problem. I think
was
we're
sharing
we're
with
wrapping up. Thanks, Thomas.
Steve
Very
and,
interesting. Thank you very much.
and Marcelo. Transparency International in Trinidad
Uh-huh.
plays a huge role with respect to legislation. For example, procurement legislation, which was passed in the parliament just a few weeks ago, is really the work of Transparency International, right? And this whole extraction thing with the multinational companies and so on. And they do that with very limited resources, but with very powerful actors. Sometimes dangerously powerful in terms of at their own risk kind of thing. But the entire procurement legislation that was recently passed by the government of Trinidad and Tobago is the work of Transparency International. It's amazing. But it was a tremendous amount of pressure put on the government over the past 3 years.
Yeah.
Does the collective brand add something to that? The fact that it is a global
Yeah,
network?
that
So
helps,
if
yeah.
it-
Oh, yeah.
If it'd been local, the impact, the reception of that.
No, you're right about that.
Yeah.
I think the government was concerned about the global international image more than succumbing to the fears of local Transparency International.
Yeah, that was a major thing with the Access Initiative as well around the Latin American region. The Chilean kept on saying, you know, the reason we can do this is because the Latin American region has said this is a value to do. And so they get that positive support too.
And so for, say, the Transparency International 300 sort of action centres in Bangladesh, how do they perceive themselves? Do they think that they're
part of
They're just
Transparency International.
sort of participating in a network, or are they like a branch of Transparency International?
I don't know because I haven't talked with
Yeah.
them. No, but yeah, that's a good question.
TI in Trinidad
What difference
has a
is
lot
that?
of
Well,
support.
it kind of, you know,
No,
are we ourselves? We have ownership of ourselves, and the branding may depend on that. Is it Transparency
that it's
International
network, so-
village name, or is it?
So the difference for me is the Global Action, a Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. At its founding director was this very dynamic man who really understood how to develop a global action network, and he was just doing it intuitively. And then they hired an executive director from Canada who turned it into a bureaucracy. So he has offices. Instead of having a network node where they can take decentralized action in response to what's happening without having to get approval by the hierarchy, he's turned it into this bureaucracy where they have an office in Kenya, and that office thinks of themselves as reporting to the Secretariat.
Well, okay. So I think that we want to avoid becoming that.
Yeah.
So we think volunteers can do really great, impactful actions in their communities, and those impacts can be sustainable, but they need some support. They need some training, mentoring, and the ongoing technical support. And that is an iterative process based on us getting feedback and learning from them and from evaluations of the programs. So the headquarters role is really to be the home of that learning, to support the community of practice that is the volunteers. We don't see a need for creating Generations for Peace offices all over the place.
Yeah. Well, I would only hesitate because I think that the Bangladesh office is the one that's doing it with the village level.
Okay.
So they'd be the ones that would take responsibility for that.
Yeah.
But then it's not so much taking responsibility for it as providing a space for it to happen. So they have, TI has a General Assembly once a year, and so there's processes that are put in place for people to exchange and learn from one another. And then there's certain sort of documents or synthesizing documents that the Global Office creates in response to what the network has asked for.
Yeah, yeah.
If that makes...
Yes, so being very responsive to the demands, and they change over time.
Right.
Yeah, we're trying to do that. Okay. Lots of food for thought. I really want to thank you for the opportunity
Thank
and
you. I enjoyed it.
sharing your brain power.
Organisation,
Superb.
network.
It's a great...
Thank
And
you.
you're going to be there for a while, Mark, if I could ask.
Well, that's another
Yeah.
big question.
Yeah. You're doing such good work, yeah.
I think personally, the last few years, we've been extending a year and a year and a year.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's healthy. I think it should either be kind of another 5 years or not at all. So.
Yeah.
But don't let your own aspirations influence that much too, because I feel that probably your aspirations have grown to do something more around what I would say the enabling environment is. And your capacity to do that has probably grown enormously. And yet the organization itself sounds extremely productive.
Yeah.
So don't feel like it's hard to keep those two separate, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I get it. Yeah. Yeah.
There's lots of opportunity for you to do the enabling environment thing without being at the organization as
Yes.
well, probably.
Okay.